she found the silver hairpin she lost 30 years ago, resting on a seat that felt like cold, human skin. This stranger knew her diary, her childhood fears, and the exact metallic taste of her own blood. But on this train, you don't just lose your luggage. You lose your soul. Close your eyes. Listen to the wheels. They aren't grinding on steel. They are grinding on us. The rhythmic, hypnotic thrum of the train wheels echoed through the cabin like the steady pulse of a massive, hidden heart buried deep beneath the floorboards. Claire pressed her forehead against the vibrating glass, the cold surface drawing the warmth from her skin in a slow, relentless leaching. Outside, the American wilderness was a vast, obsidian void, a featureless expanse of dark timber and hollow valleys that swallowed the train's flickering light. Every few seconds, a solitary tree would whip past the window like a skeletal finger, gone before the mind could truly register its shape. The vibration of the carriage traveled up through her skull, settling into her teeth and marrow until she felt less like a passenger and more like a component of the machine itself. Inside the half-empty car, the air was stagnant and thick with the cloying sense of antiquity and neglect. The smell of aged upholstery, decades of trapped dust, and the bitter, acidic ghost of cold coffee clung to the back of Claire's throat. Above her, a loose plastic light fixture rattled with a dry, persistent percussion that set her nerves on edge. The illumination it provided was jaundiced and weak, casting long, sickly shadows that pooled in the corners of the seats and danced across the ceiling with every lurch of the tracks. It was a light that did not so much reveal the interior as it did emphasize the surrounding gloom, making the carriage feel smaller and more claustrophobic with every passing mile. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to anchor her sanity to the mechanical regularity of the journey, but the sounds began to mutate in the silence of her mind. The familiar iron cadence of metal striking metal was no longer clean, it was accompanied by a subtle, unsettling undercurrent. Beneath the shriek of the axles, she heard a faint, wet crunching, a rhythmic mashing that sounded like heavy stone grinding against something soft and porous. It was the sound of 1,000-minute fractures, a sound of organic matter being pulverized into the grit of the tracks. She tried to tell herself it was merely the wind or the shifting of the old carriage, yet the moisture in the sound felt too vivid, too much like the snapping of greenwood or the breaking of small, fragile bones. The oppressive silence was suddenly shattered by the sharp, pneumatic hiss of the automatic doors at the far end of the train car. The sound was violent, a mechanical gasp that signaled a breach in their iron sanctuary. Immediately, a wave of freezing, outdoor air surged into the cabin, carrying with it the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the heavy, cloying scent of rain-soaked earth. Claire's skin erupted in a sudden forest of goosebumps as the temperature plunged, the artificial warmth of the cabin stripped away in an instant. The wind whistled through the narrow gap with a low, mournful howl, rattling the loose windowpanes and causing the heavy curtains to twitch like restless spirits. Following the rush of cold air came the sound of footsteps, distinct and heavy against the thin carpet of the center aisle. There was no hesitation in the stride, no searching for balance against the swaying of the train, each step was deliberate, measured, and terrifyingly confident. The thud of leather soles echoed through the hollow space of the carriage, growing louder and more insistent with every passing heartbeat. Claire kept her eyes fixed on her own reflection in the dark window, watching as a tall, shadowy silhouette detached itself from the gloom of the vestibule and moved into the dim, yellow light of the main cabin. The sound of the man's coat, a heavy wool scratching against itself, seemed unnaturally loud in the vacuum of the night. Elias moved with a predatory grace, his presence consuming the narrow space between the rows of seats as if the very air were retreating from his path. He did not look at the other empty rows or the discarded newspapers scattered on the floor, his focus was a singular, unspoken weight directed toward the front of the car. Without a word or a moment of hesitation, he reached the seat directly opposite Claire and lowered himself into it with a soundless, fluid motion. The springs of the worn cushion groaned under his weight, a slow, metallic protest that seemed to last far longer than it should have. He sat perfectly still, his long limbs neatly folded, becoming a permanent fixture of her immediate reality while the train continued its frantic, grinding flight into the heart of the lightless American night. The stranger did not move with the rhythmic jolting of the carriage, his body possessing a preternatural stability that seemed to defy the laws of kinetic motion. He was an anchor of obsidian shadow in the center of the flickering, jaundiced cabin, his hands resting flat upon his knees with the terrifying stillness of a funerary monument. Claire felt the weight of his stare long before she possessed the courage to meet it, a heavy and viscous sensation that felt as though a layer of warm, dark resin was being poured slowly over her trembling shoulders. It was a gaze that did not merely observe but seemed to adhere to her, clinging to the fibers of her wool coat and the sensitive skin of her neck with an oily, suffocating persistence. The way he looked at her was not the casual curiosity of a fellow traveler, but the profound, unblinking recognition of a predator that had finally located the specific scent it had been tracking through the hollows of the night. When the air in his lungs finally transformed into language, the voice that emerged was a terrifying paradox of texture and tone. It was a deep, velvet baritone that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath her feet, yet it remained eerily devoid of any human inflection, warmth, or emotional cadence. There was no hesitation in his delivery, only a smooth and unnervingly perfect flow of words that sounded like a long-forgotten incantation being whispered in a cathedral of salt. Beneath the surface of his speech, a thin, discordant sound whistled from the dark depths of his throat, a sharp hiss of escaping steam that suggested his internal anatomy was something mechanical, pressured, or fundamentally broken. It was the sound of a dying whistle or air forced through a narrow, jagged aperture, a high-pitched needle of noise that stitched itself into the fabric of his velvet words and made Claire's marrow turn to ice. The narrative he began to weave was not a story of his own life, but a meticulously detailed inventory of her own buried history. He spoke of a sweltering afternoon in July when she was exactly 8 years old, describing the precise, tart explosion of flavor from a stolen Granny Smith apple she had taken from the neighbor's neglected orchard. He detailed the sticky, translucent juice that had dried in the creases of her palms and the sharp, metallic tang of the rusted wire fence that had snagged the hem of her yellow dress as she scrambled away. As he spoke, Claire could almost taste the phantom sweetness of the fruit and feel the humid, heavy air of that long-lost summer pressing against her skin. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat so tightly that the ancient, cracked leather groaned in protest, her knuckles turning the color of bleached bone under the flickering light of the carriage. His voice shifted then, sinking into a lower, more conspiratorial register as he moved the chronology of his intrusion forward. He began to describe the suffocating, absolute darkness of the old cellar in her first childhood home, a place where she had been trapped for 3 agonizing hours during a game of hide-and-seek that had gone horribly wrong. He spoke of the smell of damp limestone, the fuzzy texture of the mold growing on the underside of the wooden stairs, and the frantic, wet sound of her own sobbing as she pressed her face into her knees. The man's description was so vivid that Claire felt the walls of the train carriage begin to contract, the yellow light dimming as the phantom scent of subterranean rot filled her nostrils. She felt the ghost of a spider's silk brush against her cheek, and her breath hitched in her throat, coming in shallow, ragged gasps that mirrored the frantic rhythm of the train's grinding wheels. Every syllable he uttered was accompanied by that persistent, whistling hiss, a sound that seemed to be growing louder and more insistent as the boundaries between her privacy and his knowledge dissolved. Claire felt the first prickle of cold sweat break across her brow, the droplets tracing slow, icy paths down her temples like tears of lead. She tried to find a logical explanation, a rational thread to cling to in the face of this impossible intimacy, but her mind was a chaotic swirl of static and shadows. She wondered if she were dreaming, if the exhaustion of the long journey had finally fractured her psyche, yet the physical reality of the men sitting before her was too sharp, too visceral to be a hallucination. The heat radiating from his direction was not the warmth of a living body, but the dry, parching heat of an oven, making the very air between them shimmer with a sickly, distorted haze. The stranger leaned forward slightly, the movement so slow and deliberate that it seemed to take an entire lifetime to complete. He began to describe a small, sapphire-blue diary with a silver latch and a corner that had been jaggedly torn away during a moment of adolescent rage. He recited the secret entry she had written in the dead of night, the ink bleeding into the porous paper, and the way she had hidden the book beneath the loose floorboard in the back of her closet. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs with such violence that she feared her chest might burst, the sound of her pulse a dull, thudding drum that competed with the roar of the locomotive. That diary had been incinerated in a backyard fire 15 years ago, its ashes scattered to the winds of a different state, yet he spoke of it as if he were holding the physical object in his long, pale hands at that very moment. The detail that finally shattered her resolve was his description of her nervous habit, a secret tic she had practiced in the solitude of her bedroom when she was 10 years old. He spoke of the way she would bite her lower lip until the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth, using the pain to anchor herself when the world felt too large and terrifying. Claire instinctively raised a hand to her mouth, her thumb tracing the faint, almost invisible scar that remained as a souvenir of those anxious years. The man's eyes followed the movement, his pupils vast and bottomless, reflecting no light from the carriage lamps. It was as if he were not looking at her, but through her, reading the electrical impulses of her brain and the chemical compositions of her memories as they flickered through her consciousness like a frantic silent film. A strange, narcotic heaviness began to settle over the carriage, a thick and cloying atmosphere that made every movement feel as though it were being performed underwater. The air had transformed from a gas into a dense, translucent syrup, a substance that was both sweet and suffocating, coating the interior of Claire's lungs with a layer of invisible dust. She found that she could no longer hear the grinding of the train's wheels or the rattling of the loose light fixture. All sound had been swallowed by the rhythmic, whistling breath of the men sitting across from her. Despite the mounting terror that screamed in the back of her mind, she felt a sudden, terrifying surge of attraction toward him, an animalistic pull that was as dangerous as it was irresistible. It was the gravity of a black hole, a terminal beckoning that promised the end of all secrets and the total dissolution of her solitary self. She watched his mouth move, the lips thin and pale, forming words that felt like physical touches against her skin. The paranoia that had been a sharp, jagged needle in her mind was now becoming a dull, thrumming ache, a part of the environment as much as the smell of the old upholstery or the cold glass of the window. She realized with a jolt of horror that she was no longer trying to look away, that her own gaze was now locked onto his with a desperate, wide-eyed intensity. She was waiting for the next revelation, craving the violation of another secret, her identity being stripped away layer by layer until nothing would be left but a hollow shell for him to inhabit. The train seemed to be accelerating, the shadows outside the window blurring into a continuous, obsidian smear that obliterated the world beyond the steel walls of their private chamber. The whistling sound in his throat reached a crescendo, a high, piercing note that resonated in the base of her skull and made her vision swim with bursts of geometric light. The scent of ozone and wet earth from the previous breach of the doors returned, but this time it was mixed with the smell of old paper and the copper tang of fresh blood. Claire felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to reach out and touch the fabric of his coat, to confirm that he was made of matter and not merely a condensed cloud of her own anxieties. Her fingers twitched on the armrest, her body leaning into the thick, syrupy air that separated them, her autonomy slipping away like sand through a sieve. The stranger's face remained a mask of predatory calm, his features blurred by the yellow light until he looked less like a man and more like a tear in the fabric of the universe, a void shaped like a person. Outside the carriage, the American night was a silent witness to their slow-motion collision, the train a lonely spark of dying light traversing an ocean of indifferent dark. Within the steel hull, time had lost its linear progression, stretching and folding until the past and the present were a single, suffocating point of contact. Claire's internal monologue had fallen silent, replaced entirely by the stranger's velvet inventory of her soul. She was no longer a woman on a journey, she was a collection of stories being retold by a voice that had never known the warmth of a human son. Every secret he revealed was a thread he pulled from the tapestry of her life, and she watched, paralyzed and enthralled, as her entire existence began to unravel in the dim, jaundiced light of the moving car. The train began to shudder, a violent, deep-seated vibration that traveled from the steel tracks through the iron frame and into Claire's very bones. The sound of the brakes was not merely mechanical, it was an agonizing, prolonged shriek that tore through the stagnant air of the cabin like the death rattle of a gargantuan beast. It was a high-pitched, grinding wail of metal flaying metal, a sound so visceral it felt as though the floor beneath her feet was being peeled open by invisible, rusted claws. Sparks must have been dancing beneath the carriage in a frenzied display of friction, though all Claire could see was the reflection of her own wide, terror-stricken eyes against the dark glass. The deceleration was uneven, a series of sickening lurches that threw her weight forward, her palms pressing flat against the cold, damp window as the world outside began to surrender its momentum to the crushing force of the iron. Outside the glass, the familiar American wilderness had been replaced by a suffocating, impenetrable gray pall that seemed to press against the train with the weight of a physical object. There were no lights from a distant town, no flickering lanterns of a station platform, and no stars to provide a sense of scale or direction. It was a formless, swirling void of mist that swallowed the train's jaundiced light the moment it touched the vapor, turning the world into a monochromatic blur of shifting ash and charcoal. The fog moved in slow, heavy eddies, licking against the windows like the tongues of phantom creatures, obscuring everything but the most immediate few inches of the dark, iron exterior. Claire searched for a landmark, a sign of human habitation, or even a blade of grass, but the void was absolute, a silent ocean of gray that had consumed the horizon and the sky alike. In the center of this gathering gloom, Elias rose from his seat with a terrifying, fluid grace that seemed to ignore the violent rocking of the slowing carriage. The sound of his long, wool coat was a dry, serpentine rustle, a whisper of fabric against fabric that felt louder than the screeching of the brakes in the oppressive intimacy of their shared space. He stood at his full height, his head nearly brushing the flickering, yellowed light fixture, casting a long, distorted shadow that stretched down the aisle like a dark finger pointing toward the rear of the train. There was no effort in his posture, no need to steady himself against the swaying walls as they lurched toward a halt. He was a pillar of absolute, unnatural stillness in a world that was rapidly coming apart at the seams. His silhouette was sharp and jagged against the swirling fog outside, a hole cut out of the very fabric of the room. Claire felt a phantom thread tighten around her chest, a mechanical pull that bypassed her consciousness and dictated the movement of her limbs. Her hand moved from the window to the armrest, her fingers tracing the cracked, cold leather with a sensitivity that bordered on agony, feeling every minute tear in the material. She could feel the individual fibers of the upholstery, the grit of decades of dust, and the underlying, dying vibration of the engine as it surrendered to the stop. Slowly, her body began to rise, her joints feeling as though they were filled with wet sand, heavy and resistant yet compelled by a force she could not name. Her heart was a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs, each strike a dull, thudding echo that resonated in her ears, but her face remained a mask of hollow, porcelain indifference. The walk down the aisle toward the rear of the carriage felt like a journey through a nightmare made of molasses. Every step Claire took was punctuated by the low, hollow thud of her heels against the thin, grimy carpet, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the thick atmosphere of the car before it could reach the walls. Elias walked ahead of her, his movement silent and ghost-like, his back a broad expanse of dark wool that seemed to absorb the sickly light of the cabin like a black hole. Claire followed in his wake, her eyes fixed on the hem of his coat, watching it sway with a rhythmic, hypnotic precision that made her head swim. The air around them grew colder with every inch they gained toward the back, a biting, predatory chill that seeped through her clothes and settled into her skin like a layer of fine, crystalline frost. Then, the final, convulsive shriek of the metal occurred as the train reached its terminal halt. The sound was a piercing, dissonant chord that felt like a needle being driven into Claire's eardrums, a scream of tortured iron that lasted for an eternity before finally snapping into a sudden, terrifying silence. The cessation of movement was more violent than the breaking itself, a jarring impact that left the world perfectly, unnervingly still. The vibration that had been her constant companion for hours vanished in an instant, leaving her feeling unmoored, as if she were floating in a lightless vacuum. The only sound that remained was the frantic, uneven rhythm of her own breathing, a wet, ragged rasp that seemed far too loud in the sudden, dead quiet of the stopped car. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of noise, but a heavy, pressurized weight that pushed against her temples and made her ears ring with a high, sustained frequency. It was a vacuum silence, a void into which all thought and reason were sucked and extinguished like a candle in a gale. Claire stood frozen in the aisle, her hand gripping the edge of a seat with such force that her fingernails bit into the aged wood beneath the padding. She waited for a voice, for the sound of the conductor's boots, for the hiss of the engine's idle, but there was nothing. The world outside the train had ceased to exist, and the world inside was a static gallery of shadows and dust. The stillness was so absolute that she could hear the infinitesimal tick of the metal cooling and the soft, dry sound of a single hair falling onto her shoulder. Elias reached the heavy steel door at the end of the carriage and placed a long, pale hand upon the handle, his fingers unfolding like the legs of a spider. There was no sound of a latch turning, only the smooth, gliding hiss of the door sliding open to reveal the abyss beyond. Immediately, the cabin was flooded with a new kind of vapor, a thick, churning cloud of white steam that rolled in from the gap between the cars in heavy, lazy coils. This was not the natural fog of the wilderness, but a dense, artificial mist that felt heavy and wet against Claire's face, coating her eyelashes with tiny, cold droplets of condensation. The steam carried a scent that was both familiar and repulsive, a cloying mixture of oxidized copper, stagnant water, and the faint, sweet smell of a butcher's shop at the end of a long day. Through the shifting veils of white steam, the last carriage of the train began to materialize like a ghost ship rising from the depths of a frozen sea. It sat shrouded in the mist, its windows dark and smeared with a layer of grime that looked like dried grease or old, translucent skin. The exterior of the car was a rusted, peeling mess of iron, the rivets looking like rows of decayed teeth along the seams of the metal. There were no lights inside this final car, no signs of life, only the rhythmic, pulsing glow of the steam as it reflected the dim, dying light from the carriage they were leaving. Elias stepped out onto the narrow, rattling platform that connected the two cars, his form momentarily lost in the white haze before his hand emerged, gesturing for her to follow into the heart of the vapor with a slow, hypnotic wave. Claire felt her feet move forward, crossing the threshold of the door and stepping onto the cold, diamond-plated metal of the transition platform. The wind here was a low, mournful sigh that spiraled up from beneath the tracks, carrying the scent of heavy grease and ancient, frozen earth. She looked down and saw only the dark, yawning mouth of the abyss between the cars, a space where the metal ground together with a slow, rhythmic groan of iron on iron. The copper-smelling steam swirled around her ankles, tugging at her coat with invisible, damp fingers, pulling her toward the dark entrance of the final carriage. Her rational mind was a distant, fading scream, a frantic prisoner in a tower of ice, shouting that she must turn back, that she must jump into the fog, but the scream was muffled by the thick, syrupy air. Her hand reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, wet iron of the last carriage's frame, the texture rough with rust and scales of old, dead paint. The copper smell was overpowering now, filling her sinuses and making her head swim with a dizzying, metallic intoxication that felt like a slow-acting poison. She took the final step, her body crossing into the darkness of the last car, the transition marked by a sudden, total change in the quality of the air. It was warmer here, a stagnant, humid heat that felt like the interior of a living throat. The door behind her did not close with a bang, but with a soft, final click of a latch that signaled the end of her journey and the beginning of something she could no longer find the words to describe. As her eyes began to adjust to the oppressive, velvety gloom of the final carriage, she realized that the silence here was different from the vacuum of the previous car. It was filled with a subtle, rhythmic ticking, a sound like 1,000 tiny clocks all counting down to the same, inevitable moment of conclusion. The shadows in the corners of the car were not empty, they were crowded with shapes that shifted just out of the corner of her eye, forms that lacked the solidity of matter but possessed the crushing weight of old memories. Elias stood a few paces ahead, his figure nearly invisible in the dark, save for the faint, pale glimmer of his hands. Claire stood perfectly still, her breath coming in slow, deliberate cycles as she waited, her soul now fully surrendered to the gravity of the men and the rusted iron cage that held them both in the center of the gray wasteland. The threshold of the final carriage felt like a boundary between two incompatible realities, a thin membrane of iron and shadow that separated the moving train from a place that had long ago forgotten the sun. As Claire stepped inside, the atmosphere changed instantly, becoming stagnant and heavy with a density that seemed to resist her very movement. There was no artificial light here, no flickering yellow bulbs or humming fluorescent tubes to offer a semblance of modern comfort. The only illumination came from the vast, indifferent heavens, where the pale, cold glimmer of distant stars filtered through windows so thick with a century of soot they looked like sheets of obsidian. This celestial light did not brighten the interior so much as it carved out sharp, jagged shapes of silver and charcoal, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to twitch and writhe across the floorboards with every imperceptible tilt of the carriage. The acoustics of the space were equally alien, transformed by the strange geometry of the car into a cavernous, echoing vault. Every step Claire took was no longer a simple thud against carpet, but a profound, metallic tolling that resonated through the hollow iron walls like a hammer striking a cathedral bell. The sound did not dissipate, instead, it traveled to the far corners of the dark carriage and returned to her seconds later as a distorted, cracked version of itself. It was as if the air was recording her presence and playing it back with a subtle, mocking delay, the echoes overlapping until the sound of her own movement felt like a crowd of invisible people walking just a few paces behind her. The floorboards groaned with a deep, subterranean frequency, a sound of wood and metal being stressed by a weight that was far greater than her own. A complex, suffocating tapestry of scents hung suspended in the unmoving air, a mixture of the clinical and the morbid. The sharp, chemical bite of naphthalene and old mothballs fought against the dry, dusty aroma of ancient parchment and crumbling leather. Beneath these more recognizable smells, however, lurked something far more disturbing, a cloying, sickly sweetness that reminded Claire of lilies left to rot in a funeral parlor or the humid, heavy air of a crypt. It was a scent of static time, of things that had been removed from the cycle of growth and decay and preserved in a state of permanent, refrigerated expiration. With every shallow breath she took, the grit of the air seemed to coat her tongue with a flavor of copper and wet ash, making it difficult to swallow. Elias came to a halt in the exact center of the narrow aisle, his tall, lean frame silhouetted against the spectral starlight like a tear in the fabric of the room. He did not turn to face her, but instead slowly raised a long, pale arm, his hand sweeping through the dark in a slow, theatrical arc that encompassed the entire carriage. His movement was fluid and silent, lacking the friction of a living body, and as he gestured, the light from the stars seemed to catch on the rows of seats that lined the car. Claire followed his gaze, her eyes straining against the gloom as she began to realize that they were not alone in the darkness. Every single seat was occupied, not by passengers, but by a silent, haphazard collection of discarded remnants and forgotten burdens. This was not luggage in any traditional sense. There were no sturdy suitcases or neatly packed trunks to suggest a planned departure. Instead, the seats were littered with the intimate, broken artifacts of lives that had been interrupted mid-sentence. On the first seat sat a single, lonely child's shoe, its leather scuffed and white at the toe, the laces trailing on the floor like a dead spider's legs. Beside it, on the next seat, lay a pair of horn-rimmed glasses with one lens shattered into a web of crystalline fractures that caught the starlight in a dozen tiny, sharp glares. Further down, a yellowed envelope, sealed with a wax stamp that had long ago crumbled into dust, rested on a pile of moth-eaten wool, its address obscured by a dark, circular stain that looked like dried wine or old blood. The sight of these objects sent a fresh wave of nausea through Claire's stomach, her heart beginning to gallop with a frantic, uneven rhythm that she could feel in the tips of her fingers. These were the trophies of the vanished, the cold evidence of people who had stepped off the edge of the world and left only their debris behind. She made the mistake of shifting her weight, and the sound of her boot against the bare metal of the floor exploded through the silence like a gunshot, the echo rebounding off the ceiling with a sharp, splintering crack. She froze, her breath hitching in a throat that felt as though it had been lined with sandpaper, her eyes darting from one seat to the next, half expecting the objects to begin moving of their own accord. Drawn by a compulsion that felt like a physical hook embedded in her chest, Claire took another step, her legs moving with a heavy, mechanical stiffness. She approached a seat near the middle of the car, its fabric a deep, midnight velvet that appeared almost black in the starlight. As her hand brushed against the side of the seat to steady herself, she recoiled with a jolt of pure, primal horror. The texture of the upholstery was not that of fabric or leather, it possessed a disturbing, pliant elasticity and a clammy, unnatural chill that felt exactly like cold human skin. It was a surface that seemed to yield to her touch with a subtle, fleshy resistance, retaining the ghost of her fingerprints for a second too long before smoothing back into its taut, ghastly shape. Her gaze fell to the center of that very seat, and there, resting upon the unnerving velvet, was a small object that made the world around her tilt on its axis. It was a hairpin, fashioned into the shape of a delicate silver butterfly with a single wing bent and partially broken away. The silver was tarnished, covered in a fine patina of gray oxidation, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Claire's vision blurred as a memory, sharp and jagged as a piece of broken glass, cut through her consciousness. She was 6 years old again, standing on the edge of the old stone well on her grandfather's farm in the sweltering heat of June 1994. She remembered the precise second the pin had slipped from her hair, the way it had tumbled into the yawning, moss-covered throat of the well, and the terrifying, distant splash that had sounded like a soft, watery sigh from the deep earth. The silence in the carriage became absolute, a vacuum that seemed to press inward on her eardrums until they throbbed with the sound of her own blood. She stood paralyzed, her eyes locked on the butterfly, waiting for it to vanish or transform into something else, but it remained stubbornly, impossibly real. She could almost smell the farm again, the scent of dry hay, the metallic tang of the well water, and the damp, earthy aroma of the stones. But here, in this frozen carriage, the hairpin carried a different scent, a faint and lingering odor of stagnant bog water and ancient, corroded copper. It was as if the object had been sitting at the bottom of that dark pit for 30 years, only to be fished out and placed here for her to find on this night of shadows. Her hand began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that started in her wrist and spread upward to her shoulder. She fought the urge to turn and run, to scream until her lungs gave out, but the gravity of the hairpin was too strong, a magnetic pull that demanded she confirm its reality. Slowly, agonizingly, she reached out her hand, her fingers inching through the thick, syrupy air toward the silver butterfly. The space between her skin and the metal seemed to hum with an invisible tension, a static charge that made the fine hairs on her arm stand on end. She could feel the cold radiating from the object, a dry, arctic chill that seemed to bypass her flesh and sink directly into her bones. The moment her fingertip made contact with the cold silver, a violent surge of ice-white sensation erupted through her nervous system. It was not a simple touch, it was a sensory invasion, a flash of freezing energy that raced up her arm and settled in the base of her brain like a shard of glass. In that same instant, the oppressive silence of the carriage was shattered by a sound that originated from just inches behind her head. It was a sharp, dry, and terrifyingly loud crack, the unmistakable noise of a thick, seasoned branch being snapped in two by a powerful hand. The sound was southwest sudden and so close that Claire felt the puff of displaced air against the nape of her neck, a cold breath that carried the scent of wet earth and winter frost. She did not turn around, she couldn't. Her body was locked in a state of absolute, crystalline terror, her fingers still pressed against the tarnished silver of the hairpin. The echo of the snap did not fade, it seemed to hang in the air, vibrating against her skin like a physical threat. She felt a sudden, crushing weight settle onto her shoulders, as if the very darkness of the carriage had gained mass and was now trying to press her down into the floorboards. The starlight through the soot-stained windows seemed to dim, the silver shapes on the walls dissolving into a uniform, suffocating black. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in short, panicked whistles as she waited for whatever had made that sound to finish what it had started, her heart a frantic, dying drum in the darkness. The crack that had resonated behind her head did not simply fade into the stillness, it seemed to shatter the final, fragile glass wall of Claire's sanity. The sound was so dry and violent that she felt a sympathetic ache in her own neck, as if the vertebrae were threatening to snap under the weight of the oppressive, airless gloom. She stood frozen, her index finger still pressed against the cold, tarnished silver of the butterfly pin, feeling the microscopic pits and scratches in the metal as if they were being etched into her own skin. A sudden, sharp surge of adrenaline flooded her system, but it brought no clarity, only a heightened, agonizing awareness of the darkness pressing against her back. The air around her grew colder, a predatory chill that seeped through the layers of her wool coat and settled into the small of her back like a sheet of black ice. With a slowness that felt like the deliberate movement of a clock's second hand, Claire began to rotate her body toward the center of the aisle. The movement was mechanical, her joints feeling as though they were filled with rusted grit that ground together with every agonizing inch of progress. As her gaze swept across the dark, velvet-lined interior, it eventually landed on the figure of Elias, but the men she had spoken to in the previous carriage had been replaced by something that defied the laws of human anatomy. He stood in the center of the aisle, but his torso appeared unnaturally elongated, stretching toward the shadowed ceiling until his head was lost in the absolute blackness above the reach of the starlight. His limbs were thin and willow-like, extending downward in long, smooth curves that seemed entirely devoid of elbows or wrists, his hands dangling near the floor like heavy, pale pendulums. The silhouette he cast was a jagged, flickering tear in the reality of the cabin, a shape that did not seem to possess the solidity of flesh and bone. Claire watched, her breath hitching in a throat that felt lined with sandpaper, as his shadow appeared to detach itself from his feet, crawling up the walls of the carriage with a life of its own. The shadow moved with a jerky, stop-motion cadence, its fingers lengthening into spindly, needle-like protrusions that brushed against the soot-stained windows. There was no sound of breathing from the tall figure, no rise and fall of a chest, only a terrifying, static stillness that suggested he was not a living being but a monument of obsidian shadow. The jaundiced light from the previous car did not reach him, he seemed to be a void that absorbed all surrounding luminescence, leaving a hole in the world where a man should have been. Just as the horror of his transformation began to sink into her mind, a new and discordant symphony of sounds erupted from beyond the thin steel walls of the carriage. It began as a faint, rhythmic scratching, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement, but it rapidly intensified into a frantic, desperate scrabbling. Thousands of invisible, sharp points were dragging against the exterior metal, a sound of mindless, swarming industry that moved with a wet, chattering quality. It was as if a tide of unseen, multi-legged things were trying to find a seam in the iron, their claws producing a high-pitched, metallic shriek that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Claire's shoes. She could hear the muffled, squelching sound of soft bodies pressing against the glass, a sound of organic matter being crushed against the soot as the swarm searched for a way to reach the warmth within. Elias remained perfectly motionless amidst the cacophony of scratching, his head tilted at an impossible, sharp angle that suggested a broken neck. In the thick, suffocating gloom where his face should have been, there were no features to be found, no mouth to speak the secrets of her childhood, no nose to inhale the scent of decay, and no brow to furrow in thought. There were only two immense, unblinking pupils that occupied the entirety of his orbital sockets, reflecting the cold, distant starlight with a dull, mineral luster. These were not the eyes of a creature that knew light, they were deep, light-drinking pits of ancient indifference that seemed to pull the very sight from Claire's own eyes. As she stared into them, she felt a sickening, hollow sensation in her chest, as if her own internal organs were being hollowed out by the sheer gravity of his gaze. The air within the carriage had reached a point of impossible, syrupy density, making every attempt to breathe a labor of agonizing effort. With every gasping inhale, Claire felt a sharp, metallic tang coating her tongue and the back of her throat, the unmistakable flavor of fresh, oxidized blood. It was a taste of old coins and open wounds, a coppery sharpness that made her head swim with a dizzying, light-headed vertigo. The atmosphere was so thick it seemed to muffle the sounds of the swarm outside, turning the carriage into a pressurized diving bell sinking into an ocean of shadows. She felt the pressure building behind her eyes, a dull, thumping ache that synchronized with the frantic, uneven rhythm of her heart. Every pulse brought a fresh wave of the copper scent, rising from her own lungs as if her body were already beginning to fail her. In the brief silences between her ragged, whistling breaths, a new vibration began to rise from the rows of seats. It was a low-frequency hum, a sound so deep it was felt in the marrow of her bones more than it was heard in her ears, originating from the scattered, broken objects that occupied the velvet cushions. The single child's shoe, the shattered horn-rimmed glasses, and the yellowed, unsealed letter all began to tremble with a faint, ghostly energy. The sound was a collective moan, a dissonant, shimmering chord composed of 1,000 whispered regrets and unfinished sentences that had never found their way home. It was the sound of a hive mind of grief, a vibrating resonance that shook the fine dust from the fabric and made the very shadows in the carriage pulse in time with the hidden heart of the lost things. A terrifying realization bloomed in the center of Claire's mind, cold and sharp as a shard of winter ice. These objects were not merely possessions left behind by careless travelers, they were the essential, distilled essences of the people who had once carried them. Each item held the literal weight of a stolen soul, a fragment of a life that had been meticulously peeled away and pinned to these seats like rare insects in a collector's glass tray. The silver butterfly pin under her finger was not just a memory of a summer afternoon in 1994, it was that afternoon, a piece of her own spirit that had been harvested from the bottom of the well and held in the dark for 30 years. The man across from her was not a passenger or a ghost, but a silent reaper of narratives, a weaver of ends who gathered the threads of existence until nothing remained but the discarded husks of the people who once lived them. She looked down at her own hands, which were still pressed against the cold, pliant velvet of the seat, and a silent, strangled scream caught in her throat. The skin on her fingertips, once pink and supple with the warmth of life, was beginning to undergo a horrifying transformation. It was turning a dull, flat shade of slate gray, the texture becoming dry and brittle like ancient, sun-bleached parchment. The transformation was spreading upward toward her knuckles with the slow, relentless movement of an encroaching frost, the fine lines of her skin deepening into permanent, jagged crevices that mirrored the cracks in the train's old upholstery. She tried to pull her hand away, but her fingers felt heavy and unresponsive, as if the gravity of the seat were drawing the very moisture and blood from her flesh, incorporating her into the furniture of the carriage. The grayness continued its slow, silent march, creeping over the back of her hand and toward her wrist like a spilled bottle of ink. She could feel the sensation leaving her limbs, replaced by a dull, wooden numbness that made her bones feel like petrified branches buried in a swamp. The smell of the carriage, the rot, the naphthalene, and the sweet, cloying lilies, was no longer something she merely inhaled, it was something she was becoming, a scent that emanated from her own pores as her biological self was replaced by the materials of the car. She looked back at Elias, her vision narrowing as the edges of her world began to fray into gray static and flickering shadows. He stood as a silent witness to her slow-motion dissolution, his elongated form a dark, final exclamation point at the end of her life story. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum, began to slow its pace, the beats becoming heavy and hollow, like the tolling of a distant, cracked bell. The sound of the scratching swarm outside seemed to grow louder, more jubilant, as if they knew the barrier was thinning and the feast was nearly ready. Claire felt the gray parchment skin reach her forearms, the coldness sinking into her muscles and turning them into rigid, unmoving clay. She could no longer feel the cold silver of the butterfly pin, for her finger had lost the capacity for touch, becoming as inanimate as the metal itself. The starlight from the windows began to fade, the silver shapes on the walls dissolving into a uniform, suffocating black that swallowed the seats, the objects, and the man who was no longer a man. In those final seconds of awareness, the smell of the old farm in 1994 returned to her one last time, but it was tainted by the metallic taste of the train and the cold, wet scent of the swarm. She realized that she would not be leaving this carriage, that her name and her face would be forgotten, replaced by the silver butterfly that would sit on this velvet seat for an eternity of nights. Her eyes, now beginning to glaze over with the same gray film that covered her hands, remained fixed on the tall, shadowy void of Elias. He was the last thing she would ever see, a towering figure of silence waiting for the exact moment when the girl named Claire would cease to be a passenger and become merely another item in the collection of the lost, filed away in the lightless heart of the final car. The elongated figure of Elias shifted in the suffocating gloom of the carriage, his first movement toward her shattering the fragile stillness like a heavy stone dropped onto a sheet of black ice. He took a single step, and the sound that erupted from beneath his boots was not the expected thud of leather on metal, but a sharp, sickening resonance that mimicked the wet, splintering crunch of breaking ribs. It was a sound of structural failure, as if the very iron of the floorboards were composed of calcified bone that gave way beneath his impossible weight. The vibration of that single footfall traveled upward through the soles of Claire's shoes, a jagged pulse of kinetic energy that made her teeth ache and her vision flicker with spots of static. Every subsequent step he took amplified the auditory horror, a rhythmic, percussive snapping that filled the narrow space with the atmosphere of a slaughterhouse floor where the debris of the living was being ground into the dust of the machine. Claire attempted to recoil, her muscles screaming for retreat, but the physical laws governing the interior of the train had begun to unspool into a chaotic, terrifying geometry. As she backed away, the aisle behind her did not end. Instead, the walls of the carriage seemed to stretch and warp, the metal lengthening like heated wax until the exit door was miles away, a tiny, glowing pinprick of jaundiced light at the end of an infinite, narrowing throat. The rows of seats multiplied in a recursive blur, their velvet upholstery pulsing with that sickly, skin-like elasticity, while the ceiling descended in a slow, suffocating arc. She was trapped in a perspective trap, a visual hallucination that felt viscerally real as the air grew thinner and the walls of the train began to press against her shoulders, forcing her to stand in the direct path of the approaching shadow. A sudden, violent lurch threw her against the cold, sweating iron of the wall as the train groaned back into a terrifying, unnatural motion. The sound of the wheels beginning to turn was no longer the rhythmic, mechanical cadence of a locomotive, it was a heavy, wet, and champing sound, a cacophony of gulping and squelching as if the steel wheels were prodding through a sea of thick, biological matter. It was the sound of 1,000 mouths trying to swallow a jagged blade, a rhythmic, choking noise that made the floor beneath her feel soft and porous, vibrating with a pulse that was not her own. The smell of the cabin shifted instantly, the previous odors of dust and lilies being replaced by the overpowering, cloying stench of raw iron, ancient rain, and the sweet, fermented aroma of a shallow grave disturbed by a plow. The cacophony was not limited to the grinding of the train, for as Claire pressed her hands over her ears in a desperate attempt to preserve her sanity, a new auditory invasion began from within. The objects on the seats, the child's shoe, the broken glasses, the yellowed letter, began to emit a collective, shimmering whisper that bypassed her auditory nerves and spoke directly to the folds of her brain. It was a sound of dry leaves skittering across a tombstone, a multitonal hiss that began to systematically erase the foundations of her identity. She felt the memory of her home address dissolve into a fine gray salt, she felt the name of her first pet evaporate like steam against a cold window. One by one, the dates and faces that comprised the tapestry of her life were being harvested by the sound, leaving her consciousness a blank, hollow cavern where only the train's grinding remained. In a moment of pure, crystalline dread, Claire turned her gaze toward the windows, hoping to see the familiar dark of the woods, but what she saw instead made her heart stutter and nearly stop in her chest. Beyond the soot-stained glass, there was no night, no stars, and no horizon, there was only a colossal, endless wall of pale, intertwined human forms that stretched toward the heights and depths of the void. The train was hurtling past a mountain of limbs, faces, and torsos, all pressed together in a silent, marble-white density that moved in a blur of terrifying speed. Thousands of unblinking eyes stared back at her through the glass, their expressions frozen in a state of eternal, ecstatic indifference. The tracks beneath the train were not made of steel and timber, but of the very same pale substance, a living, breathing road of flesh that the carriage was perpetually consuming and rebuilding as it tore through the gray wasteland. The truth of her situation descended upon her like a heavy, leaden shroud, cold and final. This train was not an instrument of travel, and it possessed no destination within the world of the living, it was a permanent, cycling engine of the in-between, a stationary machine in a moving ocean of oblivion. It was the place where the things that were no longer remembered went to be processed, a digestive tract for the fragments of souls that had fallen through the cracks of existence. She was not a passenger on a journey to a city or a home, she was a piece of data being resorted, a story whose final page had already been written in the silent, lightless depths of the well on her grandfather's farm. The realization brought with it a crushing sense of weightlessness, as if the gravity of her own history had finally been severed, leaving her adrift in the syrupy, metallic air of the car. Elias had reached her now, his presence so massive and absolute that he seemed to occupy the entirety of her field of vision. His figure was a column of pure, lightless void, a tear in the atmosphere that hummed with the sound of 1,000 distant, dying stars. His long, jointless limbs moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that has already tasted its victory, his pale hands emerging from the darkness of his sleeves like two withered lilies. The smell emanating from him was the smell of the very first second after a fire is extinguished, ash, ozone, and the sudden, chilling absence of heat. Claire found that she could no longer move her eyes or even blink, her entire being frozen in the jaundiced light of the carriage as his shadow merged with her own on the gray, parchment-textured floor. He reached out, his hand traveling through the dense, syrupy air with a soundless, fluid momentum that made the very atmosphere ripple and distort. His fingers were unnaturally long, the skin stretched so tight over the bone that it looked translucent, revealing no veins or blood beneath the surface. As he brought his hand toward her face, Claire felt a sudden, profound cessation of all physical pain, the terror that had been a screaming fire in her chest suddenly cooling into a calm, hollow emptiness. The scratching of the swarm outside, the champing of the wheels, and the whispers of the lost things all began to fade into a single, sustained note of perfect, vibrating silence. She was no longer a person defined by fear, she was a vessel being emptied of its last remaining drops of light. The tips of his fingers, cold as the surface of a dead moon, finally made contact with the skin of her temple. The touch was not violent, it was a delicate, almost tender connection that sent a final, blinding surge of white static through her nervous system. In that instant, the last remaining threads of Claire's ego, her name, her age, the color of her mother's eyes, and the sound of her own voice, were pulled from her mind like silk from a spool. She felt a sensation of immense, soaring lightness, as if she were being exhaled by the universe into a vast, silent room. The heat of her body was gone, replaced by a cool, gray neutrality that felt more like peace than death, a total surrender to the gravity of the void that Elias represented. Her physical form began to lose its cohesion, the borders of her body blurring into the thick, churning mist that now filled the interior of the car. She looked down and saw her hands, now entirely gray and translucent, dissolving into fine, crystalline grains of ash that floated upward to join the soot on the windows. There was no agony in the transition, only a strange, hollow relief, the kind of peace that comes when a heavy burden is finally set down in the dark. The carriage around her grew dim, the silver shapes of the lost objects flickering out one by one as the train's jaundiced light finally succumbed to the encroaching shadows. She was becoming a part of the environment, her essence being woven into the fabric of the velvet seats and the rusted iron of the walls. The very last spark of her consciousness remained for a fraction of a second, suspended in the center of the carriage like a dying ember. In that final, fleeting moment of awareness, the silence of the train was punctuated by a sound that carried the weight of a definitive conclusion. It was a soft, metallic chime, a sharp, triumphant ring of silver hitting the bare iron floorboards. The silver butterfly hairpin, with its broken wing and smell of bog water, had slipped from the seat and fallen into the dust, marking the exact spot where she had stood. It was the final entry in the inventory of the car, the last period at the end of a sentence that had taken 30 years to finish. The train continued its relentless, squelching flight through the wall of bodies, its iron heart beating with a steady, hidden pulse beneath the floor. In the final carriage, the shadows resettled into their permanent, frozen configurations, and the silence returned to its heavy, pressurized state. Elias stood alone in the center of the aisle, his tall, shadowy form once again becoming a motionless monument in the gloom. On the seat where Claire had sat, there was now only a faint, lingering scent of lilies and the dry, gray texture of old upholstery, waiting patiently for the next passenger who would find themselves traveling through the lightless American night toward a destination that did not exist.